is at the top of Albany's agenda this year. What's at stake for New Yorkers?
Sí, puedo yo quedarme aquí en el barrio que tanto me gusta.
Whether I'm able to secure a roof over my head or I have to sleep on the street.
It's about who New York will be for.
Rent prices have exploded across the country.
Will New York be a playground for the rich or a place where working class New Yorkers can make it?
El pueblo unido jamás será vencido.
After being in the shelter for 3 years, we deserve rental assistance for everybody.
I have been living in my apartment in Flatbush for 28 years. Without stronger tenant protection, I will become a stranger in my own community.
Our city and our state are facing an existential crisis.
It's urgent that we pass the good cause eviction bill that will protect families across New York State from retaliatory evictions and outrageous rent increases.
Our solution to the housing crisis is to center the people who are struggling the most.
We have from now until the budget is done to put tenants and homeless New Yorkers first.
It's all on the line. Corporate landlords may have the money, but we have the people.
Message your elected official and tell them to support the Our Homes, Our Power platform.
5 transformational bills that will ensure all New Yorkers have access to stable housing.
Our own.
All of us tenants have united here today because we are tired of harassment and rent hike campaigns. I want to state clearly again, rent hikes are eviction.
I am a tenant. I am a tenant. I believe in tenant power. This is our home. These are our streets. This is our power. This is our city. Fight, fight, fight. We will work together because we know when we fight, we win. Rent, the rent, the rent, through the heart. When we fight, we win. 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 When we fight, we win.
All right, everyone, thank you for your patience. My name's Danielle Mowry, and I'm really happy to be doing this panel on housing. We're really going to talk a little bit more about building community and building coalition, and about a couple of projects that both my panelists here to my left have been working on. What I was just showing you, though, was what Housing Justice for All has been working on in New York City and New York State. And they were supposed to be our third panelist. They weren't able to make it, but I'm also part of that coalition, so I want to represent them, and I also wanted to share some of the work that they've been doing in terms of messaging and advocating. And there's also different materials that they've produced that are on the different chairs that you can help yourself to. Having said that, I'm very, very pleased to introduce my other 2 panelists, and I'll let them speak a little bit more about what they've been working on and what they do. But first, just a quick introductions. This is Gabby over here is, and I'm forgetting your last name now, actually. Ramos, right? Ross. Gabby Ross is with National Low Income Housing Coalition. And National Low Income Housing Coalition really has the challenge with housing to be advocating on the federal level, really delving into policy and budget concerns and pulling together partners from across the nation. And then further over there is Alderman Byron Sigjo Lopez, who I heard speak yesterday, so I'm very eager to hear him speak again today. And he is the alderman for the 25th Ward in Chicago, and he's been working on a lot of different projects in terms of tenant protections and tenant rights, but also, most interestingly, in a recent example of coalition and community building, he's been working on a project at 18th and Peoria that the city of Chicago is putting together that's going to be 6 acres of housing, if I'm correct. And it's going to be community housing. So we're going to speak a little bit more about that. So these are both two very different challenges that these organizations and the elected office faces. For Housing Justice for All, the challenge they faced was uniting both New York City tenants and New York State tenants, which are very different populations and dynamics and different concerns in terms of like the legalities that are protecting them and the needs that they have in terms of housing. So let me pass it on to Gabby first and a little bit more background on National Low Income Housing Coalition.
Sure. Thank you, Danielle. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. Yes, like Danielle said, my name is Gabby Ross, and I'm a housing advocacy organizer with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And just a little bit about NLIHC. We are a research, policy, and advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. I live in North Carolina, but the organization is based in D.C., and we are focused on achieving racially and socially equitable public policy for the lowest income families, individuals and families, and to make sure they have access to quality and affordable housing. And we focus on a lot of different aspects of federal housing policy when it comes to working with the lowest income families, such as like the federal budget, fair housing, disaster recovery housing, Native American housing, rural housing, and homelessness issues. So that's just a little bit about NLIHC, and I can pass it to Byron.
Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you,
Sure,
Gabriela.
thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you very much, and thank you for being here today. It's a pleasure, a real honor to be with you. I'm Byron Siccho Lopez. I'm the alderperson of the 25th Ward here in the southwest side of Chicago. Encompasses the neighborhoods of Pilsen, Little Village, and University Village. A real center of the Mexican and the Latino community, Latinx community in many ways. So an area that has been experiencing increasing pressures of displacement, gentrification, and all the effects and the right to the city of working people. In the last 10 years, the community lost approximately, or I would say between 10 to 15 years, 14,000 residents, almost entirely Mexican Mexican-American residents because of the neoliberal policies that continue to push working people outside of urban areas with really not much planning or coordination and the challenges that that represents. I organized back in 2010, we started organizing and started to see the interconnections also with the school closures and other parts of what it was called the plan of transformation for the city of Chicago, or part of that, and master plans that never included the community. We started organizing, understanding that the grassroots organizing must be met also with electoral organizing, so that we have self-determination, democratic processes, zoning processes that include the community, and thus we can develop with the community. That's what you mentioned, came a long time struggle that set a really important precedent in our community. We were fighting to stop a big development of 500 luxury units on the farther east side of our community, which would add to the already tremendous pressures of gentrification and land speculation, where, again, we have seen the largest increase in property taxes in the city. Over 46% of property taxes increase overnight. Among other issues, that's what the community organized to keep 3 of our schools that were almost imminent to close in the 2013 school closures. We organized to keep the schools open. Those 3 schools are open today. And part of that strategy is also have a quality of life that includes a strong housing component. Mm-hmm. Our plan was to include 1,000 units of affordable and public housing. We're way on our way to achieve that goal. Part of that was the eminent domain of those 6.3 acres that were almost eminent to be 500 luxury units. I'm proud to say, because of the efforts of the community, those will be now almost 500, 434 all affordable units. And now we're planning with the community on how affordability and how we need to create more for families. Part of the coordination, and I end with this, is also prioritizing families who have kids in our local schools so that we can address the issue of displacement. Again, we understand the issue of housing as instrumental, as the cornerstone of how we can have a quality of life that is inclusive, democratic, and really has maybe a blueprint for the city.
Yeah. I mean, being from New York and being here in Chicago and listening to some of the implementation of different projects and different progressive actions, it makes you want to go back to New York and do even more. Let me just put it that way. So both of you touched on, like, you're building community. You're basically, and like, that's part of what I want to say is, like, there's the overall arch of how housing is a constant work in progress. And many of these actions that we do are constant work in progress. And there's many layers and there's many areas of expertise. And so it's challenging to use your expertise as effectively as possible to advocate for your community and also involve that community in the advocacy. This is a lot of information to share a lot of times. You want to keep people on message, but you also want to hear what's concerning them, and it's a back and forth, and how to keep that back and forth going while also creating a unified front. I know for Housing Justice for All, a lot of what technology in the pandemic has done is actually pulled the group together with, like, a very solid focus, of course, when the pandemic and the shutdown first started, on eviction moratorium and emergency rental assistance. So everybody was really pulled together, and we relied on, like, a lot of Zoom meetings and everything. But being sure that all voices were heard is a challenge. And we did translation. There was, like, Housing Justice for All did linguistic justice on their Zoom calls and had 2, sometimes 3 different languages being translated, and made space for there to be input from all levels of tenants and tenant organizers and nonprofit organizations that are advocates. So having said that, I know for both your district, wards, I guess I should say, I'm in Chicago. So for your ward, you did a lot of work having community meetings on a weekly basis to kind of create a framework as to what you actually needed. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about how that transpired and how that was initiated. And then for National Low Income Housing Coalition, they do a lot of Zoom work as well. And it's a back and forth as to when you're soliciting input and when you're sharing information. So we'll have Gabby speak on that as well then after you get a chance to talk about the 25th Ward.
Sure. And thank you. And just to elaborate, these plans, I always say that are better and more inclusive when we truly include the community. So and I will focus on those lots on 18th and Peoria on the southwest side of the city of Chicago, 25th Ward. These being lots where we had tremendous speculation for decades. There were several
we know
plans.
Speculation in New York.
Absolutely. So as you know, we are unfortunately, because of the proximity to downtown and because of the geographic location of our community, a real target for developers and speculators. That's why, even though our community is, again, a working class community, historically being a port of entry for generations for migrants, Polish, Czechs, Mexican American, and I think that we see that continue to be a port of entry for many people. But for developers and big interests, that is not the case. The concept of community is foreign to developers out of time, maybe completely disconnected what the needs of the community are. So that's what this last development from a property management, PMG was the name of the developer, actually a New York developer that was trying to bid in Chicago. And this had come after at least 2 other proposals have fallen through or were never materialized. There was a promise for affordable housing. There was later, I think the Midwest Jesuits, the Archdiocese, bought the lots. There was a plan for affordable housing and a plan to house the priests of the Jesuit order. None of that materialized. And overnight in 2015, the lots were for sale again. Isn't a disclosed amount of how much the transaction was, but after the promise was made, and again, what I think is very important that we understand when we assess the community, why meetings are so important. Right. Because when we were told that we must accept that as the norm, the community knew that in all of these transactions, in many of these occasions, there were nonprofits or there were no property taxes ever paid. So there was also an ask of a public benefit. So I think that is a big part of it because oftentimes development moves very quickly, but the community was well informed way before the plans even came for. These are talking about 2 decades of organizing. So when the last plan came in, there was tremendous opposition, but more than anything else, there was also a proposal to make this affordable housing that really meets the desires of the community. There was, unfortunately, a very contested election. My predecessor was involved in an indictment process, And, you know, a lot of these was come to light, where zoning decisions were exchanged, and I will say, you know, for very inappropriate actions, and zoning was for sale, was not to decide what are the needs of the community, was never part of a quality of life assessment, was basically who is the highest bidder. The community organized, and as a result, the developer took us to court as I was just coming in as a newly elected alder person in 2019. And again, that's what my first advice to anybody in elected office is always consult with your community first, and with your attorney second, right? Because it was a lot of speculation coming from the developer and even from city planners. But zoning decisions require the consulting with the community. The community overwhelmingly send letters of support in community meetings to settle this and to take them to court. Shortly after the developer settled, and we were able to now transfer those lots now to the city. This is back in 2021. So it took us 2 years just to get the lots. And after that, we immediately started the process of envisioning these new lots with the mind of what are the needs of the community. Overwhelmingly in the meetings, we talked about housing, affordable housing that really talks about the average median income of 30% AMI, that talks about family-sized units, that talks about even social housing, meaning incorporate artists and all that. And it was clear that the city did not have a framework to execute that. So consultants were hired. Now there's a process of envisioning, and now will be a request for proposals that will just ended on July 7th. So they're still in process.
This is fresh and new.
It's fresh and new, but it's a very critical concept because it will change how we look at public housing, hopefully as a blueprint of what communities can do to plan for the needs of our community. Again, this is part of 1,000 units of affordable and public housing that the community was able to push. So I'm really fortunate to represent a resilient community that fights, and as a result now we have what we're thinking 432 units, all affordable. There is a component that maybe the component for single family homes and other things, but I tell you, there was a very, very robust community participation that is still in process, but something that I'm very proud of. We'll probably be assigning the new task to a new commissioner of housing, so we look forward to finishing this project that, again, has been 20 years in the making for our community.
Wow. And you have an organizer background as well, so having that community access and having that input was pretty much, you were able to access that quickly.
Absolutely. I think being involved, being an organizer is not a minus, it's a super plus.
It's super plus, it's a superpower. Excellent. You know, actually, that reminds me of, I just want to touch on this because I feel like while we're here at this Netroots Nation, we find there's so much overlap and there's so much intersection in a lot of the work we do. And I was in this room earlier today, and Representative Garcia from Illinois was saying, and I want to quote this because basically you can replace the word tenant, or you can replace the word community member with everything he was saying about workers. Unions make our workers and our country stronger. Well, housing makes our country stronger. And there should be rights for workers, there should be rights for tenants. There should be, he was saying workers should be treated with dignity and respect. And when we organize, we win. Again, I think all of that is applicable to that fight for housing and fair housing and housing justice and affordable housing. Even social housing, which is a conversation we're starting to have in New York as well, which means it's more community-based and community-owned, and it's not being commodified for profit necessarily. And one other comment he had was when you're holding corporations accountable to stop the corporate greed. And I feel like part of what you were saying is reflecting that, is that, you know, the whole impetus for some of this development is more focused on what's the end result financially, not what's the end result for a community. So what National Low-Income Housing Coalition does really well is, first of all, they provide tons of research so that when you're making these arguments for the community, you can pinpoint what the needs actually are. And then they also will showcase when there's great examples like this. Like, I'm sure Gabby's going to make sure that everybody knows what's going on in Chicago, because this is an amazing example of something that's a success and something that should ideally be replicated. So let Gabby talk a little bit more about how National Low Income does the job they do. I keep wanting to say NLIHC, but I also don't want to talk in acronyms too much, but I keep stumbling over this.
Thanks. Thank you. And yeah, Byron, that's really amazing work. You really should be proud of your community for being so powerful. But just to talk a little bit about the, I guess, I don't know if I want to call it Zoom work, because we've kind of forced into Zoom work by the pandemic, but the National Low Income Housing Coalition, we do have a lot of working groups and calls that we have streamlined because we were having multiple calls like several days during the week, and you know, it's all great information, but not everyone is able to attend our meetings. Of course, they're recorded, but it's great to attend a Zoom meeting and, you know, being able to participate and communicate with other attendees and just learn what's going on across the country. But I will say that, you know, we do have a ton of research, and I'll mention probably later on, like some of our major reports that we released that really inform our policy advocacy.
And if I could just jump in, there's links to all of this
Oh,
as well
yes.
in the app, so
Yes.
please do check them out.
Yes, absolutely. Check out the app, and we can also connect after the panel as well if you want to learn more about our resources, which are plentiful. But yeah, even though we have so much research and just our policy team is great, our research team is great, a lot of that is not accessible to the greater community that we're trying to advocate for, which is low-income individuals, low-income families and households. So, you know, even though we're in a meeting, and with the coalition, with any coalition, you have people from different backgrounds. You have people from policy backgrounds. You have people who work in shelters, people who are policy experts, people who are just brand new to this work and just want to join a meeting because they are about to be evicted and they want to know what to do, or their neighbor's about to be evicted and they want to know how to help them and what are the best resources and who, you know, just actionable steps that they can take. So with that, you know, we have to learn how to adapt, and it's at the coalition, I'm not trying to use acronyms either. I will say we can be very policy wonky. You know, it's very much policy heavy language, but, you know, with input from our the tenants in our network, the people who work on the ground, we're learning how to really make our information accessible through Zoom, as well as other resources that are all listed in the app, including our Legislative Action Center, which is a part of our website that has all of our current advocacy ask campaigns, sign-on letters, and just great information to know if you're just trying to get started in this work. Another thing that I want to mention is, you know, the coalition, we focus on federal housing policy, and we are connected to what's going on the state and local level through our state and tribal partners. However, there is a disconnect, or something I learned just in meeting with people, there is a disconnect between those federal priorities and state priorities and local priorities. And, you know, we're asking people to, you know, meet with your members of Congress and talk about our priorities. And, you know, they're like, okay, yes, we can, these are all great priorities, these federal priorities, this is what we want to see, but this is what's happening on the state level, this is what's happening in my community, so how can I connect those two? And also, not just that, it's also people who are directly impacted by housing instability and homelessness. And, you know, they're looking at our policy priorities and they're like, this is great, but, you know, how can I tell my story in my advocacy with your priorities? So we had to make that connection through storytelling. You know, storytelling is a tool you can use to connect those, and we just had to learn as an organization, which we're still learning about, and I'm still learning, how to really make our advocacy all-encompassing and inclusive, and not just for the policy wonks or the policy experts, but truly for everybody, because as Byron said, housing is a cornerstone, housing is central, you know. And not to go too much on a tangent, but throughout the Netroots conference, you know, I've attended all these great panels, and, you know, I've talked to people afterwards, and I'm like, yes, I work for, you know, a housing organization. And, you know, they're just like, yes, you know, actually, yeah, you know, we talked about this during this panel, but absolutely, like, housing, you need housing. Housing is a foundation. You know, you can do all this great work, but if you don't have a home to come back to, at the end of the day, right, it's a little bit, you know, it's a little bit of a disconnect there, but yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I think especially with the pandemic, you know, we realize housing is the foundation, right? And then after the pandemic, or we're still in it, but after the shutdown, everybody's talking about recovery, but you can't recover if everybody doesn't have a home. You can't recover if people don't have a foundation. There's no way you can focus on different things if you're just focusing on whether you're going to have a roof over your head tonight for your kids and your family, or whether your housing situation is going to change drastically. And that was part of the reason why New York really fought hard this year for good cause eviction, which would put some limits on landlords in terms of how they could raise rents and in a way that was, it came across as exploitative because it was like raising rents $300-400, like the videos were saying in the beginning, $500. I've heard of people moving because their rent was raised $700. When you're just making it, and when the rents are already expensive, that becomes it. And I did a lot of workshops in the fall for a different project, citywide participatory budgeting. I'll give that a shout out. New York City did that for the first time this year. But the workshops, every time I did a workshop with college or high school students, their main concern was that New York City can't be my home anymore because I can't afford to be here. And I don't think that's an isolated experience. I mean, New York City is incredibly expensive. We all know that. But I don't think anymore that experience is isolated to just the big cities, just cities like New York. I think it's a pervasive feeling. And what's Gen Z going to do? They don't want to live with their parents until they're 30. What's anybody really going to do if affordable housing isn't addressed? And like Byron was saying about his area had lost a certain segment of population. New York City has had headlines like that as well. So what I think, what becomes difficult is when you're trying to encapsulate all of this information on both the state, local, and federal level, and understand where the fight should be fought, who the stakeholders are in that fight, and what the messaging should be. For good cause, it was done in both a local and a state level. And I know now there's some federal thoughts going on about tenant protections, which National Low-Income Housing Coalition is involved in as well, where that fight becomes most effective and can be enforced. For New York, and I'll be very brief about this, it ended up that some local areas managed to put some aspects of good cause into their local laws, but then the state courts, and I'm being very brief, I'm summarizing it very briefly. So the local courts were saying, no, this is a good idea, but it's not something that's legal. It needs legislation first at the state level before it can be implemented at the local level. So it's this back and forth. And I think a lot of times with advocacy, you don't have time to understand all of that, which is why understanding how to pull it all together and get input. National Low-Income Housing Coalition is getting input because federally they're trying to have some sort of rental protections if loans are backed federally. And for Byron, you might want to speak a little bit about Just Cause, which I know is an ongoing process as well, and that's being done at the state or city level or both?
So Just Cause can be done at the local level, but
for Chicago.
Okay. But we do have some challenges, for instance, in terms of tenant rights around rent control. For instance, we do have a preemptive law that bans rent control at the state level. So any kind of rent stabilization bill locally, will require us to leave the ban on rent control that ALEC basically put in 1999. So since 1999, we have not been able to provide, for instance, I tell you, in our case, we have small homeowners who want to help their tenants. They have tenants that have been there for generations. However, when property taxes increase, we are not able to provide any kind of incentives or help to small homeowners, but big developers do take advantage of these incentives. In the last round of property tax assessments, financial interests basically got their appeals, and all of that got shifted to working class neighborhoods. So we have higher property taxes will be reflected in our tenant bills. So we are starting this organization so we don't let the big developers pitches against each other.
Right.
So we see how lifting the ban on rent control can be helpful not only for homeowners, but also tenants. But also understanding other tools like social housing, right?
Right.
That is important, and public housing. So I think that briefly, I think one of the things that the mayor's transition team has developed is a very, very clear guideline on how we can, and there's 6 goals that they want to propose. Tenant rights is one of them, is one of the goals that is clearly delineated. Just cause is one of them as well. So I think it is important that we see the importance of having elected officials that believe in this work. We proposed just cause, 3 years ago. The previous mayor committed. As soon as the financial interests got organized, it got off the table. So we got to see also, and I would like to tie it, how radically wrong some of these real estate agendas are. Right now, for instance, we are pushing, I think across our cities, LA, New York, Chicago, we see how difficult it is to create affordable and public housing. We have allowed developers to write our laws federally, state, and citywide for so long that now we have so many barriers as the one that I mentioned. But it shouldn't be that way, right? I think that, for instance, right now that we want to create again, when we require state or federal support, very rarely we get that support, right? HUD has a lot of work to do, as well as here in the state, when we have tried every attempt to pass this legislation, we have been met with tremendous opposition. But when we are asking to address the issue of homelessness, I think the call is a moral call. We're right now today in Chicago. We're ready, and this is good that we're going to have a hearing on bringing Chicago home ordinance, for instance, that wants to address the issue of homelessness and to provide shelter as a human right. Right now, we're just going to have a hearing on July 27. There's a proposal to increase the real estate transaction tax in a minimum amount. We already have real estate organizations organizing to stop any kind of conversation. That is morally wrong, but also financially, economically, it is a debacle for our economies when our workers cannot have any kind of housing. So we're going to have this hearing, and we got to continue to push for these policies because these issues that we have also have to do with revenue. That's what I'm getting at. When we're trying to pass legislation, it has to come with revenue. Still, federally, we don't look at housing as a human right. We look at it as a commodity. And as long as that's the case, our laws are pervasive. Even right now, we have agencies like the Chicago Housing Authority, $240 million minimum in reserves. But the agency is set up not to create more public housing, but to give land to developers to subsidize and create mixed-use housing, which is a tremendous loss in housing when we need public housing just as much as we need social housing, affordable housing, and all of in between, right? But I do want to be clear that this lack of coordination, it is very intentional. It is intentionally driven by lobbyists and real estate industries that do not understand our communities. And we as people, we got to make sure that we know what communities are like, right? That we fight for this legislation at every level of government because that coordination is key for revenue and implementation.
It's completely key. And I want to just hand it over to Gabby here because I think for my advocacy, National Low Income Housing Coalition kind of helped paint the big picture a little bit better and also then presented different partners across the country that were doing different things and what their issues were, like listening to what the Chicago issues are right now. And one way that you're doing it specifically is like they're gathering input about what should be tenant protections. And I want to let you have some time to speak about that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, so right now there is a comment period for the Federal Housing Finance Agency, also known as FHFA. Just a sidebar, housing work, it's just a bunch of acronyms. So FHFA, I'm going to be saying some more acronyms probably. But yes, so right now NLIHC is looking for, or we're engaging with renters to provide feedback during this comment period about their experience in their housing and what they faced. And for the FHFA comment period, it's for, these renter protections would be for renters who live in properties with federally backed mortgages. And we have top 4 priorities for that, which I can just name really quickly so you can just understand what we're trying to accomplish. So our number 1 priority for federal renter protections is source of income protections to stop landlords from discriminating against households receiving housing assistance and also giving families a greater choice about where to live. Number 2, just cause eviction standards and the right to renew leases to help protect renters from housing instability. 3, anti-rent gouging protections to stop landlords from dramatically raising the rents. And 4, requirements to ensure housing is safe, decent, accessible, and healthy for renters and their families. So that is what we're trying to accomplish with this FHFA comment period. And I believe
There's like sessions each week or every other week or something?
Yes. So we have a renter protections working group where which is where we engage the renters or the tenants that we that are in our network, and also people who have just spread the word, and just asking them specific questions about what they've gone through. I think each meeting has like a separate focus depending on which priority we're discussing. We have 2 more of those meetings because the FHFA comment period ends on July 31st. So we're trying to get that feedback from renters as soon as possible. And I believe they're on Wednesdays at 4 p.m. Eastern time. And again, if you look in the app, all of our calls are there. And I believe I made sure to highlight those 2 dates. So I believe it's like July, I'm sorry, I'm checking my calendar to make sure. July 19th and July 26th are the next 2 meetings for the Renter Protections Working Group. And also just a little more about that. The Renter Protections Working Group did temporarily replace our Policy Advocacy or Policy Advisory Committee, which is where we engage tenants and our NLHC members about different housing issues that are affecting them as renters. And that's a quarterly meeting. So if you're interested in becoming an NLHC member, please see me after the panel or visit our website. But yes, so through those meetings is how we try to gauge what's going on really like in the community and across the country. But yeah.
Well, I'm going to just explain a little bit of how their meetings work. Is that they basically are this big Zoom and they're presenting all these issues, and then they'll like break out and they'll have highlights from each partner. So it's really informative. And then they'll have smaller Zooms that you then are having direct input. So speaking of direct input, I know the 3 of us could go on all day about housing issues in particular. Really, a lot of this is what I wanted to focus on, was like kind of building community as well and keeping voices involved. So we do have some time for questions, and I think because the other panel went a little over, I don't know if anyone's in here right after us, but is somebody in here after us? Anyway, we do have a few minutes for questions, so let's see if anyone has questions, and we'll take those. Go ahead. And I'll repeat your question after you say it so people can hear it.
So I think, housing is coming out of the pandemic, obviously it was a bit of a supply and demand thing, and that was one of the things that drove price up. At least, I'm from Ohio. We've got urban areas. I'm the state senator. I've got the highest rent burden for renters of any of the 33 districts. I've got the highest housing cost burden for owners
Yeah.
in the 33 districts. But so I kind of feel like, to put it in severe weather, parallel with severe weather, we've got a short-term housing tornado that's coming through as a result of the pandemic. But due to age of housing stock, we have a long-term hurricane that's going to create much more havoc and just shrink supply, because supply is not going to be livable. One of the housing advocates, Cleveland State's got a very strong urban policy school, and there's a housing professor there that basically said residential housing has a 100-year lifespan. Well, in some of our urban communities,
Right.
built in 1920, 1940. 100 years fast forward, it's based on quality of initial build and upkeep. My point is, we have a short-term housing price spike, and maybe that'll settle. But maybe 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we've got a massive constriction of supply, unless we address literally rebuilding all of our communities.
I feel New York dealt with a lot of that as well, because there was 2 factors, but they weren't mutually exclusive. One was really pushing for more housing, build more housing. And then the other was pushing and saying, like, we'll strengthen tenant protections, because the people that are there need to stay, and the housing that exists needs to be livable. And they need to be able to not feel retaliated against if they're getting repairs. There needs to be money in programs for homeowners to be able to make repairs if they're landlords. But they can't be mutually exclusive. And I feel like that's part of the issue, is that there's state, local, and federal level things going on for housing. And as Byron mentioned, not all of that confusion is unintentional, right? So that totally is a valid point. It's like, which comes first? Well, neither comes first. They both come first. And I'd be interested in hearing what your thoughts are on that as well.
Yes, and that's a great question. I think every municipality must be thinking in that line. The city of Chicago alone has a shortage of about 120,000 units by an estimate by the lawyers' committee on housing. So I think like what we got to think is, to your point, in this century, what does affordable housing looks like, right? And these concepts of social housing are imperative. And I'll give you a perfect example. We have in the city of Chicago right now almost 100 empty Catholic churches, 100. Those churches actually have facilities, rectories, convents that are completely unutilized and decaying on top of that. So looking at city assets, but also looking at assets as a city, because we must understand that it is more expensive for any municipality to deal with the consequences of our housing residents. We have consequences on mental health, we have consequences on health, right? Or ER rooms have more often visits, we spend more money in that. And, again, the issues of instability, violence, and so forth. So there are many reasons why we should invest in housing. I think what we have not grappled with is, what does housing look like in these kind of times when we have climate change on top of that? And I think that's where the coming together of all agencies, faith leaders, elected officials, community groups, communities in general, must look at it. That's why quality of life plans and participation is so critical. I would like to share with you, because I think this goes perfectly in what Mayor Johnson did recently, which was convening private sector, public sector, elected officials, on developing a transition report with recommendations. Housing was one of them. And I would like just to share, because it's important, because this is a comprehensive, I don't want to simplify it, something that is a very complex issue, but because there's a number of pieces, there's no silver bullet. But I do think that here there's some elements that we gotta start to look at as we look at this transformation on how we look and how we think about affordable housing. And what that even looks like. And social housing, public housing, and all these concepts must be incorporated in cooperatives even. So the number one part of the plan is to provide and house residents with services of their choice, so that we can have safe quality, affordable housing for all. So the first part of, especially with the asylum seekers, with the humanitarian crisis, has to do with emergency housing, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what I mentioned. We have convents, we have infrastructure out there that can be easily, I wouldn't say easily, but much more easily replaced or repurposed or rehab. So we got to be creative. I was touring the other day, some convents. It was almost like time has frozen, because the convents were still almost intact. They were almost SROs, almost there. But yet nobody could have any kind of plan to say, look, let's repurpose this. As we have all these vacancies, we have literally people in viaducts and families with children even in inhumane conditions. So looking at all infrastructure to see how we can address that, bring Chicago homes. Chicago Home is an important piece of legislation, because we must invest. I don't remember when was the last time the city of Chicago invested in shelters or emergency housing. And that goes with a lot of municipalities. We got to start investing in that, because now we have climate change, we have tornadoes, flooding, and all that. We got to understand how we're going to face that. We got to do it. And we got to have the revenue for that. The second goal was to develop and enable support homes that will address issues, for instance, that have come because of all the new challenges that we have. For instance, domestic violence victims, people with disabilities. Our federal laws do not provide any kind of recourse to these very extreme cases when people are fleeing for safety, or accessibility when in case of disabled residents. The preservation, the third goal is the preservation of naturally occurring affordable housing. It is more expensive for us as a city to allow banks to foreclose. It's more expensive when we have homes that are decaying than helping people to go in foreclosure, to help people so that they don't have to lose their home to this to the sale of property taxes like we have here in Chicago, and other schemes, redlining, credit and other restrictions that make it very difficult for us. So we got to also address the issue of big banks bailing banks, but yet and financial institutions, but not bailing working people that will repay, unlike others. Tenant rights, of course, just because I think that you covered that in detail. So that was the number 4 goal, and we look forward to working together. The 5th goal, because I want to add to what was said, is improving municipal housing, meaning that we need to invest in public housing, cooperative housing, and for that we need to have institutions that believe in public housing, and institutions like lending institutions. I would think the option of public banks and reestablished community banks is critical in that, and to make sure that we have TIF money, like money from our communities that goes for that. The City of Chicago in 2019, just to give you an example how outrageous it gets, invested $2.9 billion, with a B, in 2 mega developments in the City of Chicago. We have right now probably a little bit more than that we could invest for housing. But when we start talking about public housing, affordable housing, you see the same financial interests that now asking even the Chicago Teachers Fund to be rescued and bailed out to oppose any kind of proposal for public affordable housing. Those are the entrenched interests that we cannot allow to be in government. And finally, and I'll end with this, is the increased opportunities, because that was part of that, for generational wealth. That is also part in our communities, and we have to acknowledge that. Again, we got to revolutionize how we look at that social housing. There's ways, as we said, partnering, I think the partnership with some faith leaders is a perfect segue for that kind of social housing. But in the meantime, we have 15,000 empty lots in the City of Chicago. The mayor of the City of Chicago has said we cannot have empty lots, vacancies at the same time as we have people in the streets. And I think that is when we're partnering with faith leaders that are now looking into rebuilding and building more affordable housing to address the issue of supply. Because the supply of housing, affordable and public, is not going to come from developers. It's going to come from government. And we must regulate, the private sector. But I tell you that the issue of housing is one that must come with public investment, and for that we need the political will to do so.
Yeah. And I'm sorry I didn't recap your question, but in essence, you were asking about, you were commenting on how in Ohio, in the area that you represent, it's very rent burdened for both regular renters and also for the elderly population as well. And that the need is not just to address the immediate need, which is you liken to a hurricane, I think, or a tornado. And then the other need was that it's an ongoing, bigger need that's really a bigger storm that we have to deal with, the lack of housing. It's the immediate housing, but it's also the aging housing, the housing that has to be reimagined, the housing that has to be built still. And like what you're saying, I do think it does take political will because it needs to be reimagined. I know when I was doing these workshops with these high school and college kids, and they would bring up housing, I then went back and did a housing workshop for the one high school that I was at, and I was talking about how in the 30s they started public housing, and then also eventually Mitchell Lama started in New York City, and how the kids started suggesting things like, well, why isn't there housing that if you graduate from a public high school in New York City, you have access to 6 months of housing, that's reduced rate or something like a dorm style housing that you just get access to. And then it's like, why not? Is that going to happen? Who knows? But thinking like that, just throwing ideas out like that, what's addressing the need? And I know for what you were dealing with in your community imagining and framework, you were talking about elderly population as well as families, and also creating space for artists. And I'm going to let Gabby jump in here because I'm interested to hear if there's other regional or issues that you've heard coming up in terms of that as well, in terms of the political will to deal with creating more housing in different ways. Or is there not? Okay. or just because they really deal a lot with policy. Well, I think actually at the policy level, federally, there's more talk about community land trust going on as well, and funding that and public land trust to create opportunities for communities to build. Mm-hmm. But if you heard of anybody who's been implementing it in any way? that you can, I'm sorry to put you on the spot like that, but that you can think of that pops to mind?
No, nothing that comes to mind immediately. I'm so sorry about that. But, you know, like as far as political will to do anything with housing, it's really minimal, like on the federal level. I will just say that. I mean, housing just always falls to the wayside. We do have two champions in Congress, Congresswoman Maxine Waters and Congressman Sherrod Brown from, I believe he's from Ohio. Yes, yes. So we have two champions for housing, even though it is a issue that affects literally everyone in the country. But as far as community land trusts, you know, I admittedly don't know much about it. I should know more. You know, I know I'm in Chicago, and you know we have a powerful advocate that we're connected with in Chicago, J.R. Fleming, and he does a lot of work with community land trusts. So I would be happy to learn more from not just you all, but also from you, Byron, about that issue as well.
Yeah. Go ahead. There's a question here.
Hi, my name is Alex. I'm a New Yorker. I've also been, you know, a volunteer with the Campaign for Good Cause. So thank you.
Excellent.
For all the work the coalition is doing there. My question is regards to, you talked about the importance of engagement with the community and sort of, you know, collaboratively developing the proposals of what we want for our community. My experience locally when I have gone to these sort of meetings, these community board meetings, the town halls that are held, is often it's not renters like me in those audiences. It's, you know, wealthy homeowners whose primary concern is, we don't want anyone to be here, there's not going to be enough parking, you're going to make my property values go down because the wrong kind of people are here.
And yet parts of New York City are 80% renters.
Exactly, and so it doesn't ever feel like the community that's on the street or that are in my building that are in those meetings. So how do you think about that? How do we make sure that these processes for community engagement are actually representing the community that not just is, you know, able to show up,
Right.
But also like the people who would need to benefit from homes, especially young people, working people, etc.
As somebody who lives in a rent-stabilized apartment in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, I'm now on my community board. And I was clarifying something about good cause eviction in one of the meetings, like my first meeting. But yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. And I'd love to pass it on to both the panelists to have comments. And then I think we might have time for one more question as the other panel comes in, but let's hear from them about this.
I'll give it to you.
Okay. Well, that's a great question. I think that without our communities and without a political will, it is difficult to implement anything. There is a really well-organized group of the realtors, agencies and developers and so forth, very well organized. They understand legislation, they understand town halls, they attend all the meetings, and they used to control the agendas. That's what I think is important, that the organizing is on the base, and I think democracy is in the streets. There's no shortcuts, in my opinion. I think what you're doing is what we're supposed to be doing, and we need to be doing more and more. What I think is maybe an experience in Chicago that is helpful is how, for instance, schools and teachers and other working class communities become really good allies in this movement of informing our residents about these interconnections between school closures and real estate investment and the dismantling of public housing with all these financial interests that are profiting from our communities. And not only that, I think that the first step is really electoral representation. I do think the other part is making, like you mentioned, these institutions actually work as we at least are intending to do. And, you know, for that we need to start addressing, you know, centuries of colonialism and capitalism that have structures that are really draconian. Again, we cannot even reimagining housing, you know, even in 100 years we know that we haven't really done revisioning or re-envisioning of what HUD could be looking to do about, in our case, for instance, the Chicago Housing Authority can be doing. And these agencies become complicit in the gentrification or dismantling even of public housing, which is in the plan of transformation, one of the most saddest thing to see when we lose public housing. In the city of Chicago, 288,000, almost 300,000 residents, mainly black residents, left the city of Chicago in the last 10 years because of school closures, mental health closures, and the loss of stock in public housing. So I think that the political will is done, and I think that's our hope, that we use these hearings to organize, to inform, to mobilize the majority with our tenants, that are small homeowners. I said corporations don't vote, but they do put money into it. So I think that we gotta, I think, see the value on electoral representation, because even when we used to organize, we will go to the hearing just to be told the complete opposite of what we organize. Now we are going to meetings and we have representatives that are hearing us. We have a mayor that comes from a grassroots base. But these institutions are still challenging a new policy. So I think that I don't think the work ever stops, but we're doing, I think, is the beginning. I really encourage anybody to really look and to go to these meetings. I tell you, I used to be a teacher. When we start seeing how we were treated, not only our residents or teachers or families or kids, I think the city of Chicago, and again, I just quick again because I want to make sure that we give credit. Karen Lewis was the former president of the Chicago Teachers Union, and challenged Rahm Emanuel back in 2011, which was a very, very difficult thing to do with the level of popularity. And she did it on these same grounds. Housing was a big part of it. Yeah. So I think organizing in the classroom, organizing in our streets, in our community rooms, you'll surprise. One community at a time, maybe one city at a time, when we start changing things across the country.
But I do agree. Yeah, exactly. It's like, I do agree with what you're saying, though. It's like, who's in the room? Who is in the room? And it's not just part of why I wanted to have this panel was I wanted to talk about like the messaging and getting people involved, getting people informed. But ultimately, it is then who is in the room and whose voices are being heard. And part of that is being addressed by like storytelling. But it comes down to as well being in that room where the decisions are being made, being in that room where the policy is being implemented and being shaped. And how is that done in a way that's coordinated and more effective and more forceful? I'm going to let there be one more question, because then I think we have another person coming in to start. Is that correct? There's another group coming in after us? Okay. So one more question. Did you have a question? Okay.
I know I've talked to some of you about stuff, but I'm in Minneapolis, and there is landlords that are not really held accountable to some of the housing that they let it go. And a lot of times when I move people into housing. So a lot of times when I'm moving people into housing, these housing units are just decrepit and like not taken care of. And even my own self as a renter, I've dealt with a lot of black mold, a lot of all these things where the landlords just paint over it, and that's kind of where we are in the landlord. Like there's no protections around mold in our city. So even if you have mold, they can come over and paint over it, and that's all they do. And so the biggest thing is that we're running into is that we have health concerns in housing, and then on top of that, landlords are not held accountable, or even investment people are not held accountable. We have all these people moving into housing, and then renters are like booted out because of people moving into places. I'm sure you have similar things happening in your cities. So I'm just wondering how to advocate around that, because I also work in the homelessness community, which I do have people that sometimes live in my building where I rent. But then it's like at the same time, what do you do with that, right? Because I'm a renter and then also advocating for homelessness. So it's complicated.
It's complicated. I mean, I know she should be talking the tenant protection stuff. If you want to quickly say something.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for your question. Yes, as far as holding landlords accountable, we have, I think I mentioned this earlier, we have a tenant leader cohort where we have just a group of tenant leaders who are leaders in the community who have advocated against the issues you've mentioned, specifically like around mold issues and how, people are getting sick and it's just allowed to happen and no one's being held accountable. So that is definitely something that we want to work on the federal level. As far as federal level advocacy, I know personally I've worked in homelessness services. I've also worked with low-income families and individuals in public housing, in Section 8 housing in Washington, D.C. And, I remember working with families and trying to get them to apply for rental assistance and helping them with that process. And a lot of families told me, they were like, my nothing works in my apartment. My apartment is filled with mold, insects, or bugs, pests. So I don't even want to apply for rental assistance because I don't even want to live here. So it's really an issue, and I think that also goes into the issue that was being discussed earlier as preserving the housing supply and investing in those repairs, because it truly is, like you said, decrepit. But yes, so I mean, we've talked before, but no, we should definitely talk more about the tenant protection work, especially what you're doing in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
I'll be happy to connect more about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd love for us to go on, but the panel before us ran a little late, so my apologies to the panel that's coming after us, because we now are running late and bumping you. Thank you, everybody, so much, and for those of you who are watching this streaming now or later, thank you again. I am going to say one more thing in closing. Abigail Disney has a movie out that's called The American Dream and Other Fairy Tales, and it popped in my head this morning when I was listening to the union people speak, and I knew that there's going to be this housing panel later today. And I think that movie, if you look it up on her website, you're able to screen it very easily. It just really ties the fact that, like, workers' rights, housing rights, treating people, treating workers, treating everybody in our community with respect and dignity. It's just so tied together, and when one goes, the other goes. And I think it was even Sherrod Brown that said on a National Low Income Housing Coalition call one time, when you lose your home, everything falls apart. I'm paraphrasing him, but that was the essence of what he said, and it's true. Housing is essential, it's the foundation, and I really appreciate all of you for showing up. Thank you so much.
Thank you.